At 01:30 a.m. on the morning of June 6, 1944, Major Hans von Luck was awakened in his quarters near Bellenville by the sound of aircraft engines so numerous that their combined drone made the windows vibrate in their frames. The air carried the smell of early summer in Normandy, cut hay, apple blossoms, the particular sweetness of the French countryside that 4 years of occupation had made familiar to German soldiers stationed there. Von Luck was 33 years old, a career officer from Flensburg near the Danish border, who had commanded reconnaissance units in Poland, led armored columns through France in 1940, and served under Rommel in the North African desert before wounds and reassignment brought him to command Panzer Grenadier Regiment 125 of the 21st Panzer Division. His experience had taught him to recognize the significance of sounds that peacetime ears might dismiss. The aircraft overhead were not conducting a routine bombing raid. Their numbers and their pattern indicated something far larger. The reports that reached von Luck over the following hours confirmed what the sound of engines had suggested. Paratroopers were landing east of the Orne River in the operational area that his regiment was responsible for defending. Gliders were coming down near the bridges at Bennoville and Ranville, their silent approach delivering troops whose objectives included the crossings that German defensive plans considered essential to any counterattack against coastal landings. The invasion that German commanders had anticipated and prepared for was beginning, and von Luck's regiment, equipped with tanks, assault guns, and veteran infantry, was positioned within striking distance of landing zones whose capture was still contested. The opportunity for immediate counterattack, the violent response that German doctrine prescribed for exactly this situation, existed in these pre-dawn hours as it would never exist again. The counterattack did not come. Von Luck's repeated requests for permission to move against the paratroopers met responses that epitomized the command paralysis that would characterize German operations throughout the Normandy campaign. His division commander, General Lieutenant Feuchtinger, could not be located during the critical early hours. His whereabouts that night remained a subject of speculation that post-war accounts would not definitively resolve. The Corps and Army headquarters above Feuchtinger required authorization from OKW, the Supreme Command in Germany, before releasing armored reserves for counterattack. OKW would not act without Hitler's personal approval, and Hitler was asleep. The standing orders that governed the situation prohibited disturbing Hitler's rest for decisions staff officers considered themselves unqualified to make independently. The Panzer regiment that might have struck the vulnerable paratroopers in their first hours ashore sat in assembly areas while the chain of command that should have unleashed it consumed itself in procedural paralysis. Von Luck watched the eastern sky lighten toward dawn with the frustration of a professional soldier witnessing opportunity evaporate. His tanks were fueled, his crews were alert, his reconnaissance had identified objectives whose seizure remained incomplete. The paratroopers who had landed around the Orne bridges were consolidating positions that every passing hour made stronger, were being reinforced by additional lifts that the growing daylight made visible, were transforming from vulnerable targets into defended positions that counterattack would need to breach rather than prevent. The doctrine that von Luck had learned and practiced across 3 campaigns demanded immediate response to penetration, prescribed violent counterattack before enemies could organize, assumed that speed would compensate for the strength that hasty response could not provide. The doctrine was correct. The system that should have implemented it was not functioning. The naval bombardment that commenced at dawn announced that the paratroop landings were merely the operation's opening phase. The sound of heavy guns reached von Luck's position as continuous rolling thunder, their shells falling on coastal defenses whose destruction was a prerequisite to amphibious assault. The scale of this bombardment exceeded anything his experience had provided reference for. Thousands of shells per minute falling on positions that individual German soldiers were attempting to defend against forces that they could not yet comprehend. The invasion was not a raid to be repulsed. It was the main Allied effort against the European continent, and the counterattack forces that should have been moving to contest it remained stationary while command authority circulated through channels that the situation's urgency could not accelerate. Von Luck's regiment would eventually receive orders to move, would eventually conduct the counterattack that doctrine demanded. The orders came too late, arrived after daylight had exposed every route to the aircraft that filled Norman skies, reached units whose movement would now occur under observation that darkness had previously denied. The opportunity that the night had offered would not return. The counterattack that might have influenced the invasion's outcome would instead demonstrate why counterattacks that had worked in 1940 would not work in 1944. The doctrine that paralysis prevented von Luck from executing had been developed by officers who understood armored warfare as thoroughly as any soldiers in history, refined through campaigns whose successes had validated every principle it embodied. General der Panzertruppen Leo Freiherr Geyr von Schweppenburg had contributed to this doctrine's development and had argued forcefully for its application against any Allied landing in France. He was 58 years old in June 1944, a former cavalry officer whose transition to armor preserved the cavalryman's instinct for mobile warfare while adding the firepower that mechanization provided. His face bore the aristocratic features that his title suggested, his manner the confidence of a professional whose expertise had been demonstrated rather than merely claimed. As commander of Panzer Group West, he held responsibility for the armored reserve that would determine whether any Allied invasion succeeded or failed. Geyr's operational concept for defeating an invasion reflected principles that experience had proven sound. The coastal defenses that Rommel was constructing could delay a landing, could impose casualties that might discourage weak-willed attackers, but could not by themselves throw a determined assault back into the sea. The forces required for comprehensive coastal defense exceeded what Germany could provide across the hundreds of kilometers of potential landing beaches that the French coastline offered. The solution that German doctrine prescribed was defense in depth. Coastal forces would identify the landing's location and fix attacking troops in their beachheads, while armored reserves concentrated inland would deliver the counterattack that would penetrate to the beaches and eliminate the invasion before it could consolidate. The concentration that this doctrine required was precisely what Geyr had advocated in the months before the invasion, and precisely what command disputes had prevented him from achieving. His panzer divisions were scattered across France in dispositions that reflected competing priorities rather than coherent operational planning. Rommel, commanding Army Group B, wanted armor positioned close to the beaches where it could intervene immediately. His experience of Allied air power in Africa had convinced him that movement after the invasion began would be impossible, that any reserves not already forward would never reach the fighting. Geyr believed that forward positioning would merely expose armor to naval gunfire and air attack before it could be employed effectively, that concentration further inland would preserve forces for the decisive counterattack that properly coordinated Bayerline was ordered to execute on June 9th achieved nothing except additional losses. Panzerlehr drove toward Tilly-sur-Selle against British positions that had spent 3 days consolidating, and the attack stalled within hours in the same bocage terrain that had shredded his column on the march north. The hedgerows that a Norman farmer had built over centuries to contain livestock and mark boundaries now contained German armor with equal efficiency, funneling tanks into lane openings where a single anti-tank gun registered on the exit could kill vehicles one at a time with mechanical patience. Bayerline pulled back, reorganized, and reported his findings upward through a command structure that continued to demand results it had already made impossible. Rommel understood what Bayerlein was reporting because he had been saying the same thing in different language since January. The fundamental problem was not the courage of German soldiers or the quality of German equipment. It was that the conditions required for German armored doctrine to function, room to maneuver, freedom from air attack, the ability to concentrate rapidly and strike before the enemy could adjust, had been systematically removed. The Allies had not stumbled into a favorable situation. They had constructed one, deliberately, over 2 years of preparation. The air supremacy over Normandy was not accidental. The deception operation that kept the 15th Army frozen at Calais waiting for a second landing that never came was not accidental. The logistics flowing across the beaches, building Allied combat power faster than German counterattacks could reduce it, were not accidental. Rommel had seen the shape of the problem clearly enough to write it in a memorandum to Hitler in April. If the panzers were not permitted to fight on the beaches on the first day, the battle would be lost. He had been overruled by the reserve argument, by Hitler's personal control of the OKW divisions, and by the compromise that satisfied no one. The attempt to mass armor for a decisive counterstroke continued through June and into July, each effort breaking apart before it could concentrate. On June 13th, elements of the 7th Armored Division, the British Desert Rats, veterans of the North African campaign, found a gap in the German line near Villers-Bocage and pushed through it. A single German officer, SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a Tiger tank, drove into the leading British column on the main street of Villers-Bocage and destroyed more than a dozen vehicles in a single engagement that lasted less than 15 minutes. The action briefly closed the gap and has since become one of the most analyzed single-vehicle engagements of the war. What it did not do was change the strategic situation by a single kilometer. The gap was closed for a day. The British pressure continued. The German line bent without breaking, absorbing every available panzer division into defensive fighting that consumed the offensive power those divisions had been assembled to deliver. By mid-July, 7 of the 8 panzer divisions in Normandy had been committed to the front in a defensive role, holding ground against British and Canadian pressure around Caen. The Americans to the west, facing infantry and terrain rather than concentrated armor, were being bled in the bocage, but were not facing the full weight of German armored strength. It was precisely the situation Rommel had warned against, the panzers tied down, unable to concentrate, unable to strike, slowly ground away by an enemy whose material production they could not match. On July 17th, Rommel's staff car was attacked by Allied aircraft on a road near Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery. The car left the road at high speed, and Rommel was thrown clear, suffering a serious skull fracture. He was evacuated to a field hospital and did not return to command. He had spent 8 months in France trying to fight a battle the way it needed to be fought, against the resistance of men who outranked him and understood the situation less precisely. He was removed from it not by a German staff decision, but by a Spitfire at low altitude on a Norman road, which was, in its way, entirely consistent with everything he had been warning about since winter. The command that replaced Rommel's clear-eyed assessment with something closer to catastrophe came from Hitler directly, and it came in early August. With the American breakout at Saint-Lô already underway, General George Patton's Third Army pouring through the gap torn open by Operation Cobra and swinging west into Brittany and south toward the Loire, Hitler ordered a concentrated armored counterattack westward through Mortain to the sea at Avranches. The objective was to cut the American supply corridor at its narrowest point and sever Patton's advance from its base. The operation was designated Lüttich. Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr, rebuilt to partial strength after the attrition of June and July, was among the formations assigned to it. Every senior German commander in Normandy opposed the plan. General Paul Hauser, commanding the 7th Army, argued that the correct response to the American breakout was an orderly withdrawal to a defensible line, not a westward lunge that would extend the German position further into a deteriorating front. General Hans von Funk, commanding the armored group assigned to lead the attack, submitted his reservations in writing. Bayerlein, who had now spent 2 months watching German armor destroyed by the same air power that would be waiting over every road to Avranches, understood what the attack column would look like from above on a clear August morning. The objections were noted and overruled. The attack was ordered for the night of August 6th. The initial advance moved in darkness and achieved a degree of surprise, pushing several kilometers west before dawn. Then the sun came up, and the weather cleared, and the fighter bombers arrived in numbers that the men on the ground had not encountered, even in the worst days of the march from Le Mans. British Typhoons worked the columns in continuous rotation, each flight replacing the one before it, the rockets leaving white trails against the August sky before the sound reached the men below. American P-47s struck the flanks. The armor that had driven west through the night stopped, burned, and blocked the roads for everything behind it. The attack that Hitler had ordered as the decisive stroke to fracture the Allied position in Normandy was destroyed in approximately 12 hours of daylight. What the Mortain counterattack accomplished, beyond its own destruction, was to drive German forces deeper into a pocket that was already forming. While armored strength of the 7th Army drove west toward Avranches, American forces to the south and British and Canadian forces pressing down from the north were converging on Falaise. The pocket tightened through the second week of August. By August 19th, the gap at Falaise had been largely closed. What remained inside it, the remnants of 2 German armies, tens of thousands of men, the wrecked equipment of divisions that had entered Normandy as the most powerful armored force in the West, was destroyed in a killing ground that eyewitnesses on the Allied side described as unlike anything they had seen in the entire war. The roads leading east out of the pocket were so thick with destroyed vehicles and dead horses and abandoned equipment that the smell reached Allied aircraft flying overhead. Bayerlein survived Normandy and continued fighting through the retreat across France, through the Ardennes offensive in December 1944 and into the final collapse of 1945. He was captured by American forces in the Ruhr pocket in April of that year, the same encirclement that claimed Model's life. He cooperated extensively with American military historians after the war, providing detailed operational accounts of Panzerlehr's destruction on the Norman roads and the German armored failures of the campaign. He died in Würzburg in January 1970 at the age of 69 in the same city where he had been born. His post-war accounts remain among the most precise primary sources available for understanding what Allied air power did to German armored movement in France. Erwin Rommel never returned to command. While he recovered from his skull fracture in Germany, the July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler connected several of Rommel's associates to the conspiracy. Rommel's involvement remains historically contested, but Hitler's circle considered the connection sufficient. In October 1944, 2 German generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen and presented him with a choice: a public trial or a private death by poison, with his family guaranteed safety in exchange for his silence. He chose the poison. He was 52 years old. Germany announced that he had died of wounds from the July air attack. He was given a state funeral. The man who had written in April that the invasion could only be defeated on the beaches, who had argued for 8 months that Allied air power made any other approach suicidal, was buried with full military honors by the government that had ignored everything he said, then killed him for knowing it. That embodied weeks of preparation were lost, their reconstruction demanding effort that ongoing operations would not permit. The institutional memory that experienced staff officers carried, the understanding of unit capabilities, the knowledge of terrain, the relationships with subordinate commanders that effective coordination required, was eliminated in ways that replacement personnel could not immediately restore. Panzer Group West continued to exist as a designation, but the organization that the designation represented had been functionally destroyed. Geyr attempted to reconstitute his headquarters while simultaneously managing operations that the invasion's progress made increasingly urgent. The counterattack that doctrine demanded required concentration of armored divisions that his damaged command structure struggled to coordinate, required assembly in areas that air observation made hazardous to occupy, required movement along routes that air interdiction made progressively difficult to traverse. The divisions that should have been massing for decisive counterattack were instead being drawn into defensive fighting around Caen, their strength consumed in attritional combat that dissipated the concentrated force that counterattack required. The system that should have preserved armor for decisive employment was instead permitting its destruction in engagements that produced casualties without producing results. The recommendations that Geyr submitted to his superiors reflected professional assessment that the campaign's conduct was systematically preventing the employment of armor in ways that might affect its outcome. He advocated withdrawal from positions around Caen that defensive fighting was making untenable, argued for the preservation of armor strength through maneuver rather than its consumption through static defense, proposed operational approaches that might restore the initiative that current methods were sacrificing. His recommendations reached commanders whose authority could have implemented them and whose judgment rejected them, reached ultimately to Hitler, whose insistence on holding ground precluded the flexibility that Geyr considered essential. The response to Geyr's advocacy was not implementation, but removal. On July 2nd, he was relieved of command, his professional judgment deemed insufficiently aggressive by superiors whose distance from the fighting permitted them to demand what proximity would have revealed as impossible. His replacement, General Heinrich Eberbach, inherited a situation that Geyr's removal could not improve. The same air supremacy, the same command constraints, the same requirement to execute counterattacks that conditions made suicidal. The change in commanders changed nothing about the circumstances that were destroying German armor regardless of who directed its employment. Geyr departed Normandy with the bitter knowledge that the doctrine he had helped develop and had advocated applying was being destroyed not by its own inadequacy, but by conditions that its designers had not foreseen and that its executors could not overcome. The counterattack concept was sound for the battlefield it assumed. The battlefield of Normandy was not that battlefield, and the adjustments that the new conditions demanded were adjustments that command arrangements would not permit. The armor that should have been preserved was being consumed. The counterattacks that should have been concentrated were being dissipated. The campaign whose outcome armored response was supposed to determine was being lost while armored forces died in operations that could not affect it. The pattern that the first week established repeated through June and into July, with variations that confirmed its essential features while destroying the forces that repetition consumed. Operation Epsom, the British offensive that began on June 26, drew German armor into exactly the attritional combat that Geyr had warned against and that his removal had not prevented. Von Luck's regiment participated in the defensive fighting that Epsom provoked, its tanks and infantry committed to holding ground that British pressure systematically contested, its strength eroding through engagements whose cumulative effect exceeded what any single battle would have produced. The British offensive aimed at encircling Caen from the west, its axis of advance threatening positions that German commanders could not permit to fall and therefore could not decline to reinforce. The reinforcement that the threat demanded drew panzer divisions into defensive fighting that consumed them piecemeal, their commitment producing exactly the dissipation that Geyr had argued concentration would prevent. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, newly arrived from the Eastern Front, were fed into the Epsom fighting as they reached the front, their strength absorbed by defensive requirements before any counterattack could employ them for offensive purposes. The 2nd SS Panzer Division joined the defensive effort, then the 1st SS, then additional formations whose arrival German command had anticipated would enable the concentrated counterattack that would throw the Allies back. The counterattack never materialized because the conditions it required never existed. Each division that reached Normandy was immediately drawn into fighting that consumed the strength counterattack would have employed. The assembly areas where concentration should have occurred were under constant air observation, their use for massing armor inviting attacks that would destroy formations before they could be committed. The routes that divisions would have used to reach counterattack start lines were interdicted by aircraft whose presence made daylight movement progressively more costly. The coordination that multiple division counterattack required was complicated by headquarters disruption that the Lekain strike had produced, and that ongoing air attacks continued to impose. Von Luck experienced this pattern through operations whose tactical success could not translate to operational effect. His regiment would counterattack locally, would retake positions that British advances had seized, would inflict casualties that demonstrated German armor retained its fighting quality. These local successes changed nothing about the larger situation because they occurred at scales too small to affect it, because the strength they consumed could not be replaced, because the British forces they engaged could be replaced, and were replaced faster than German forces could destroy them. The arithmetic of attrition favored the side that could replace losses, and that side was not Germany. The bocage terrain that characterized much of Normandy compounded problems that air supremacy created. The hedgerows that bounded Norman fields restricted observation in ways that should have favored defenders, but they also channeled movement in ways that made armored maneuver predictable. German tanks advancing through bocage country could use only the lanes and gaps that terrain provided, their routes known to defenders who positioned anti-tank weapons accordingly. The open warfare that German armored doctrine assumed, the sweeping maneuvers, the exploitation of penetrations, the deep thrusts that encircled enemy formations, was impossible in terrain that reduced armor to infantry support, that negated the mobility advantages that tanks were designed to provide. The artillery superiority that the Allies possessed transformed every German assembly into a potential catastrophe. Naval guns whose range reached miles inland could strike concentrations that ground-based artillery could not reach, their shells arriving with weights that no field fortification could withstand. The massed fires that preceded British and American offensives exceeded anything German forces had experienced on the Eastern Front, their density creating conditions that German defensive doctrine had not addressed. Units that survived air attack during movement faced artillery bombardment upon arrival, the cumulative effect degrading formations before they could engage the enemies their movement was supposed to reach. Von Luck watched his regiment's strength decline through this cumulative attrition with the professional assessment that experience provided, and that circumstances made irrelevant. The replacements that arrived could not match the veterans that casualties removed, their training abbreviated by urgency that combat readiness required, and that training timelines could not accommodate. The tanks that maintenance returned to service could not match the tanks that combat destroyed, the replacement rate falling progressively behind loss rates that each week's fighting imposed. The regiment that had begun the campaign as a veteran formation was becoming something different, still capable, still dangerous, but diminished in ways that continued operations would accelerate rather than arrest. The counterattacks that von Luck's regiment executed through July followed patterns whose predictability had become their defining characteristic. Orders would arrive specifying objectives, routes, and timelines that staff officers removed from the fighting had calculated according to assumptions that frontline conditions systematically contradicted. The regiment would assemble in areas that air observation had identified, would advance along axes that defensive planning had anticipated, would strike positions whose defenders had been reinforced precisely because German counterattack doctrine made the striking predictable. The attacks would achieve local penetrations that air power and artillery would systematically reduce, would suffer casualties that the penetrations could not justify, would withdraw to starting positions that subsequent orders would require them to leave for repetition of the same futile cycle. The night of July 8th brought orders for a counterattack that exemplified everything wrong with German operations in Normandy. British forces had launched Operation Charnwood, a direct assault on Caen that threatened to capture the city whose retention German command considered essential. Von Luck's regiment received instructions to counterattack the British penetration, to restore positions that the assault had overrun, to demonstrate that German armor retained the offensive capability that doctrine prescribed. The orders specified assembly areas that daylight reconnaissance had certainly compromised, approach routes that defensive planning had certainly addressed, timing that coordination requirements made inflexible regardless of what conditions the timing encountered. Von Luck assembled his available forces in the pre-dawn darkness, the smell of diesel exhaust and nervous sweat filling air that would soon carry the sounds of combat his experience allowed him to anticipate. His tank strength had fallen to fewer than 20 operational vehicles, the attrition of preceding weeks having consumed machines faster than repair or replacement could restore them. His infantry companies had shrunk to platoon strength, their ranks filled with replacements whose faces he barely recognized and whose training he could not trust. The regiment that doctrine assumed would execute counterattack with the weight and coordination that success required existed now primarily in organizational charts whose relationship to actual capability had become increasingly theoretical. The counterattack commenced as ordered and failed as experience predicted. The assembly areas had indeed been observed, artillery concentrations falling on positions that German forces were attempting to vacate as the bombardment began. The approach routes had indeed been prepared, anti-tank guns engaging the leading vehicles at ranges that German optics should have detected and that haste had prevented proper reconnaissance from identifying. The British defenders had indeed been reinforced, their strength reflecting anticipation that German doctrine had made reliable. Von Luck's tanks burned along routes that other tanks had burned along in preceding weeks, their destruction adding to totals that each counterattack incremented without affecting outcomes that the totals accumulated toward. The air attacks that accompanied ground engagement demonstrated how completely the Allies had integrated their capabilities into systems that German forces could not match. Fighter bombers appeared over the counterattack within minutes of its commencement, their arrival suggesting communication between ground observers and air controllers that German command arrangements could not replicate. The aircraft engaged German armor with rockets whose accuracy had improved through weeks of practice against targets that German operations reliably provided, their attacks destroying vehicles that ground combat had not yet engaged. The counterattack dissolved under combined pressure that no single arm had produced, its failure reflecting integration that German forces experienced without being able to counter. The withdrawal that followed the counterattack's collapse carried von Luck's regiment back through terrain that the attack's optimism had traversed hours earlier. The vehicles that survived sought concealment in orchards and farmyards that offered protection from air observation, their crews assessing damage that the engagement had produced and that maintenance would need to address before the next counterattack that orders would certainly demand. The casualties that the regiment had suffered included officers whose experience could not be replaced by the promotion of subordinates whose preparation had not equipped them for responsibilities that attrition was imposing. The formation that darkness protected was weaker than the formation that dawn had committed, and the orders that would arrive tomorrow would assume capabilities that today's fighting had further degraded. Von Luck understood that the counterattacks he was executing served no purpose that military logic could justify. They consumed strength that preservation would have retained, achieved results that achievement could not exploit, repeated patterns whose repetition had made them predictable and whose predictability had made them suicidal. The doctrine that demanded counterattack had been designed for conditions that Normandy did not provide, had assumed capabilities that German forces no longer possessed, had prescribed responses whose execution accelerated the defeat that response was supposed to prevent. The professionals who recognized this could not change it because the system that employed them could not incorporate their recognition into decisions that recognition should have informed. Operation Lüttich, the counterattack that Hitler ordered at Mortain in early August, represented the doctrine's final and most catastrophic application in Normandy. The operation committed Germany's remaining armored reserves to an offensive whose objectives the forces available could not achieve, whose failure would open paths that the commitment was intended to close, whose execution would destroy the strength that might otherwise have conducted the defense that failure would make necessary. Von Luck's regiment did not participate directly in Lüttich. The 21st Panzer Division was engaged elsewhere, but the operation's consequences would determine the context within which all subsequent German operations in France would occur. The strategic situation that prompted Lüttich reflected desperation that tactical analysis could not redeem. American forces had broken through German lines at Avranches, were pouring into Brittany and swinging east in movements that threatened to encircle German armies in Normandy. The corridor through which these forces flowed presented what German doctrine identified as a classic opportunity, a narrow passage whose severance would isolate the forces that had passed through it, would restore the coherent front that breakthrough had ruptured, would transform American success into American catastrophe. The doctrine was not wrong about the opportunity, it was wrong about German capacity to exploit it. 4 panzer divisions concentrated for the Mortain counterattack under conditions that concentration had made lethal throughout the campaign. The assembly that offensive operations required occurred under air observation that darkness could only partially defeat, aircraft equipped with flares illuminating movements that night was supposed to conceal. The routes that the attack would follow were predictable because terrain made them predictable, because German doctrine made them predictable, because repetition had established patterns that Allied intelligence had learned to read. The defenders who would receive the attack had been reinforced because the attack had been anticipated, ultra-intercepts providing warning that German security could not prevent and that American preparations fully exploited. The attack began on August 7th and failed within hours in patterns that the campaign had established and that Lüttich confirmed definitively. German armor achieved initial penetrations that suggested the doctrine might yet prove valid, advanced several kilometers toward objectives whose capture would have severed the Avranches corridor. The penetrations encountered defensive positions whose preparation reflected anticipation, whose strength exceeded what hasty attack could overcome, whose depth absorbed momentum without permitting breakthrough. The air attacks that had destroyed every previous counterattack destroyed this one with particular thoroughness, clear weather permitting sortie rates that Overcast had previously constrained. The 4 panzer divisions that Lüttich committed emerged from its failure as shadows of the formations that had entered it. Tank losses exceeded what remained, the vehicles that burning hulks represented having constituted Germany's final armored reserve in the West. The personnel casualties included officers and NCOs whose experience had maintained unit effectiveness despite equipment losses, whose deaths degraded capabilities beyond what equipment replacement alone could restore. The divisions that had been Germany's instrument for affecting Normandy's outcome had been destroyed in an operation that achieved nothing except their destruction, had been sacrificed to doctrine whose application conditions had made suicidal. The consequences that followed Luttich extended beyond the forces directly engaged to determine the campaign's conclusion. The American forces that the counterattack was supposed to isolate instead completed the encirclement that the counterattack's commitment had made possible. The Falaise pocket that formed around German armies in Normandy reflected the absence of armored reserves that might have kept escape routes open, the destruction of forces that might have covered withdrawal, the elimination of capabilities that might have imposed delays that surviving forces required. The catastrophe that German command had sought to prevent through counterattack was catastrophe counterattack had enabled, its failure opening paths that its success was supposed to close. Von Luck experienced the Falaise pocket's closing from positions east of the Orne, his regiment attempting to hold corridors through which surrounded forces might escape. The sounds of that collapse reached him as continuous artillery fire, as the drone of aircraft whose attacks were destroying the forces attempting to flee, as the mechanical noise of vehicles struggling through routes that congestion had made nearly impassable. The army that had conquered France in 1940 was being destroyed in France in 1944, its destruction accomplished through operations that its own doctrine had demanded and that its enemies had learned to anticipate and exploit. The retreat from Normandy carried von Luck's regiment across France in conditions that retreat imposed and that pursuit compounded. The roads that led eastward were clogged with vehicles and refugees, their progress measured in kilometers per day rather than the kilometers per hour that operational planning assumed. The aircraft that had dominated the Normandy battlefield dominated the retreat routes with equal thoroughness, their attacks destroying columns whose density made concealment impossible and whose movement made them targets that dispersal might have protected. Von Luck managed what withdrawal operations his command could execute, his authority extending to survivors whose connection to organizational structures had become increasingly nominal. The regiment that reached the German frontier bore no resemblance to the formation that had awaited orders on the morning of June 6. The tank strength that had numbered dozens had fallen to single digits, vehicles lost to combat and air attack and mechanical failure and fuel exhaustion, accumulating into totals that no accounting could precisely establish. The personnel who had filled company rosters in June were largely gone, dead, wounded, captured, missing in the chaos that retreat had produced. Their replacements themselves replaced by subsequent replacements whose tenure proved equally brief. The formation retained its designation and its colors and the institutional memory that surviving veterans preserved, but the combat power that designations were supposed to represent had been consumed by operations whose failure had been predictable and whose prediction had changed nothing. Von Luck experienced the Falaise pocket's closing from positions east of the Orne, his regiment attempting to hold corridors through which surrounded forces might escape. The sounds of that collapse reached him as continuous artillery fire, as the drone of aircraft whose attacks were destroying the forces attempting to flee, as the mechanical noise of vehicles struggling through routes that congestion had made nearly impassable. The army that had conquered France in 1940 was being destroyed in France in 1944, its destruction accomplished through operations that its own doctrine had demanded and that its enemies had learned to anticipate and exploit. Geyr von Schweppenburg observed the Normandy campaign's conclusion from the remove that his relief had imposed. his professional judgment vindicated by outcomes that vindication could not affect. The counterattack doctrine that he had advocated had been destroyed not by its inherent flaws, but by conditions that its designers had not anticipated and that its executors could not overcome. The concentration that doctrine required was impossible under air supremacy that made concentration suicidal. The speed that doctrine demanded was impossible when command arrangements imposed delays that speed required eliminating. The coordination that doctrine assumed was impossible when headquarters were destroyed and communications were interdicted, and the institutional foundations for coordination were systematically dismantled. His post-war years provided opportunity for reflection that wartime had not permitted, for analysis whose conclusions operational urgency had precluded. Geyr contributed to the historical understanding of the Normandy campaign through interviews and writings that documented what he had experienced and what experience had taught. The counterattack failures that had destroyed German armor in France reflected not professional incompetence, but professional doctrine confronting conditions that doctrine had not anticipated. Air power that transformed the battlefield's fundamental character, command arrangements that prevented adaptation, insistence on methods whose repetition had made them predictable. The lessons were available for those who would study them, for military professionals preparing for future conflicts whose conditions might differ as dramatically from 1944 as 1944 had differed from 1940. Geyr died on January 27, 1974, in Irschenhausen, Bavaria, at the age of 88. His obituaries noted his command of Panzer Group West and his relief after advocating positions that events would validate. His career illustrating the limits of professional judgment in systems that professional judgment could not govern. The doctrine he had helped develop and had sought to implement remained studied in military academies, its principles examined for insights that changed conditions might still provide, its failures analyzed for warnings that future commanders might heed. Von Luck survived the war through subsequent campaigns whose details his memoir would document with the clarity that professional observation provided. The Eastern Front, where the 21st Panzer Division was transferred after Normandy, offered different conditions that produced different results without altering the fundamental trajectory that Normandy had established. He ended the war in captivity, his surrender occurring in circumstances that the war's conclusion imposed on millions, whose individual experiences varied while sharing the common outcome that defeat had produced. His post-war decades included the memoir that preserved his perspective on events that historical distance was already beginning to obscure. The book documented what he had experienced on June 6 and afterward, the paralysis that had prevented timely counterattack, the air supremacy that had destroyed every counterattack that paralysis had delayed, the institutional failures that had consumed German armor in operations that professional judgment had recognized as futile. Von Luck died on August 1, 1997, in Hamburg, Bavaria, at the age of 86. His account remaining in print for readers whose interest in understanding how and why the Normandy counterattacks failed found in his testimony evidence that analysis alone could not provide. The failure of German counterattacks in Normandy reflected the collision between doctrine designed for one battlefield and conditions that created another. The immediate violent response that doctrine prescribed required capabilities that Normandy did not provide, air parity that the Allies had eliminated, command flexibility that German arrangements precluded, unpredictability that repetition had destroyed. The forces that executed these orders were destroyed in operations that destruction could not redeem, their sacrifice accomplishing nothing except the acceleration of defeat that their preservation might have delayed. The doctrine was not wrong. The conditions were not what the doctrine assumed. The gap between assumption and reality was filled with the burning vehicles and broken bodies of soldiers who paid for errors that others had made and that no one possessed authority to correct.